subordinate you economically or politically or whatever, right? This was, of course, especially the case after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That made it much more acceptable because then you had a different kind of globe. The problem in this part of the world is you have every reason to be suspicious of the motives of external actors, because external actors have intervened quite periodically, quite systematically in the politics of all of these countries, largely for reasons of natural resources, but also strategic location, etc. So I suspect not only just elites, but mass publics are much more wary of democracy, so to speak, whereas that was an important component and a reassuring component for the other fight. When the countries we studied were, in some sense, a new form, what we call a new mode or new modes of transition. So one of the first things we realized was that there were different ways of democratization, what we call modes of transition. So there's not just one way to democracy. There are all kinds of different paths. But those paths, interestingly enough, lead to relatively similar outcomes. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the case between Portugal and Spain. Portugal was this peculiar coup d'etat by military officers, huge mass mobilizations, nationalization, and all this revolution, they called it. Whereas in the Spanish case, it was carefully negotiated. And of course, the Spaniards will tell you one of the reasons that the Spanish transition went so well is because they wanted to avoid what was happening in Portugal. so they saw what was happening in Portugal, and so actors deliberately negotiated and compromised with each other in order to prevent the kind of uncertainty and mobilization, etc., which was making the Portuguese Revolution so difficult. Now, so what this meant, historically, the two most common ways of becoming democratic are conveniently exemplified by Great Britain on the one hand and France on the other. Reform and revolution. So the general perception is that the democracy comes from below. Right? In one case, you have mobilization by excluded groups. The ruling oligarchy or semi-democracy or whatever it is makes reform concessions to the mobilized groups, in franchises or whatever it is, allows the excluded groups more access to political power. And in the British case, it takes 200 years, roughly, and it sort of looks like a staircase, right? And you take a long time, and in between, you kind of socialize the actors. So the British case was regarded as the model, the most desirable way. But again, the basic idea was that democratization came from below. Right? France looks dramatically different. 1789, 1830, 1848, 1870. So in the French case, you didn't have these nice little steps. It took place also in a more compressed period of time, but it was much more dramatic, and it involved exclusion and even driving into exile or guillotining the previously ancien regime and putting in place a new one, and then failing, putting in another one anyway. So those were the two models, the two modes of transition, reform and revolution. What we observed was that in the cases we studied, they were neither one nor the other. We'll leave aside cases like Nicaragua or Cuba or whatever, but the one case, the cases that we were looking at, neither of those became democratic, incidentally, at least certainly not right away. We were looking at two new kinds of transition. The one was, I think I mentioned it, in the Spanish case and now the South African case are the two which everybody looks at and discusses, of so-called pacted transition, transitions by negotiation. And usually what you have is a fragment of a previous regime, a more moderate, we call soft liners, the previous regime making an alliance with the more moderate elements of the opposition. come to an agreement, and then they even make other agreements. Some of those agreements are public. In the case of Spain, sometimes they're private, but that's a different, they make a deal. And they agree on certain kinds of features, laws, etc., of the emerging democracy. And that makes the transition much more, less uncertain and much more reliable in terms of outcome. No doubt about that. So everybody, I think, now identifies the Spanish, and to a lesser extent the South African, which is a copy, as a matter of fact. The South Africans studied the Spanish transition, so did the Poles, and so did the Hungarians, and the Uruguayans. There's a number of those cases, Chile eventually, all negotiated transitions, and somehow the Spanish the model for this. But that's a new way of doing it. People didn't do it that way historically. That's a new invention. It began actually in Venezuela, but that's a different story. The other, and the most common form of transition to democracy is what we call democracy, or democratization by, or transition by imposition. It's the previous regime that imposes democracy. And of course, in the case of the communist countries, it was a fragment of the Communist Party. That's what Gorbachev was. Gorbachev was a perfectly hard-holding, legitimate member of the Soviet Communist, and he is the one through Glasnost and at least Perestroika who began this process. Now, what often happens, of course, is it gets out of control. But the impetus is to impose democracy, the kind of democracy which protects the interest resources of at least some, if not all, of the members of the previous oligarchy. Brazil is another case. So Brazil takes 16 years to democratize, but it's always controlled by the Brazilian military. So the Brazilian military decide who could be a candidate, and then gradually allow civilians to win, etc. Eventually, Brazil not only becomes democracy, but Brazil is good democracy. Everybody would agree today that Brazil is one of the best functioning new democracies in the world. So, new kinds. I leave it to you to decide where you are in this mapping. I gather that somebody has taken this concept, revolution. I don't know who it is, but this is a concept which was invented by Timothy Garton Ash from Oxford to describe certain characteristics of the transition in Soviet society. So you had a movement from below, but the movement from below, as in Poland in particular, limited itself and settled for eventually a pacted transition. So it was called the self-limiting revolution. So you had the revolutionary impulse, but then you decided it was too dangerous, especially in this case in Poland, because you feared that the Red Army was going to invade you, so that was clearly a strong incentive not to go too far too quickly, right? So you ended up. So you start in one kind, this revolution and this mobilization reform, moving toward revolution, and so the idea is that you compromise. The transitions are not pure, those are ideal types, and therefore you have combination. And one of them is a combination of reform and revolution. So I gather that concept has repeated. Finally, one of the basic ideas of so-called transitology is that the mode of transition influences both the likelihood you will be successful, but also the kind and type of democracy, and even the quality of democracy you will eventually have. But you have to, so to speak, identify and even perhaps promote a particular type. And I'll leave it to you. I have been talking with people and I have no idea, because I know nothing, I'm learning about Egypt. People keep telling me that on the one hand, yes, this is not a revolution. By no standards has this been a revolution. It's something short of a revolution. But the question is it a combination of mobilization from below, a revolution, somehow a mixture of reform and revolution, with a pact? But we don't know what the pact is. A secret. And the problem, because I had several countries, there was no public pact. Sometimes, in the case of Venezuela, something like 50 years after the pact was signed, the contents were revealed. So it was a secret arrangement. But if you were studying Venezuela, and if you're studying today in Egypt, the way you know that there's a pact is by what does not happen. In other words, the typical content of a pact is to respect limits on the use of which, of use of your own capacity to harm the other side, so to speak. So what you do is what you don't do. So you don't use force in certain situations, or you don't carry further certain kinds of demands or mobilization, or whatever it is. And the problem with that is the only evidence for the existence is what is not happening. So you have to have this kind of theory in your head. This is the way the Egyptian military would have acted, but they didn't. Now, did they do this because they had a deal? And can you find similar behavior on the part of the opposition, or whatever it is, where they only go so far and then decide? I don't know. I just said it's a very problematic thing from the point of view of political science, because we prefer to look at positive things rather than negative. We prefer to score, if not actually count, things that happen rather than things that don't happen. But this is the kind of thing which is characteristic of pacted democracies when they are secret, when they're based on secret agreements between political actors. Thank you for your
This was really a great lecture because we have been privileged to listen to these fresh thoughts by Professor Shmeitter, and the benefit of those who did not come from the beginning. I just refer to the major points that Professor Shmeitter made with respect to what is particularly distinctive about the Arab Spring. First of all, this is a sort of pessimistic observation, but this is borne out by the experience of other countries. There is no association between transition from authoritarian rule and prosperous capitalism. So don't expect high rates of economic growth. Don't expect also redistribution of national wealth, at least in the medium and in the short and the medium term.
Second, especially also given the conjuncture of the cycles of capital. You're doing it in a downward cycle, whereas most of the countries I'm thinking of are doing it in an upward cycle.
I said in concept in political science called the long wave theory, that when the economy goes through long waves of prosperity followed by stability and then depression, and the best prospect for transition to democracy takes place during the period of expansion of the world economy. So the Arab Spring takes place at a moment of slowdown and recession in the world economy. The second observation is that instead of the role of political parties in other parts of the world, it is the civil society which was very active, very instrumental in effecting, at least the fall of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. The third feature is that of the wide use of information technology. And Professor Shmeitter added that information technology is good to help revolt against authoritarian regimes, but it might not be very effective in establishing, consolidated democracy. The fourth feature is that the positive neighborhood effect, which was made in the case of Eastern Europe, is lacking in the Middle East. We don't have a regional organization interested in the promotion of democracy. We don't have also,
it's interesting, it doesn't have the resources to do anything about it.
So, regional actor who can help in this process. And the fifth point is that the benevolent foreign intervention, which because this is also again the neighborhood effect of Korea. Foreign intervention was quite favorable to the process of democratization in South Korea, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America. But there is suspicion about foreign intervention in the Arab world, and there is also perception that the foreign powers are not really interested in democratization in Arab countries. And finally, the mode of transition is very difficult to describe the mode of transition in Arab countries. The major modes of transition that were observed elsewhere include parallel transition, imposed transition, revolution, and reform. And as what happened in Arab countries will not be seen as revolution, at the same time, not entirely progressive or gradual process of reform. So a certain scholar from Oxford coined the term revolution, combination of reform and revolution. I think these very interesting ideas. We expect also very interesting discussion, and the floor is open for you. Professor Suad Chalabi, Ambassador Dr. Suad Chalabi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa. Thank you very much for...
Can you use a mic? Is there someone? Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, speech and statements from Dr. Philip, and I feel that you have specified very important points regarding the Arab Spring, and especially the Middle East compared to Latin America and East Europe. You have not mentioned religion as one of the factors that can be either damaging democracy or as an advantage to democracy and to political parties. They can have competitiveness from different religious parties if they are solid parties. But in case in the Middle East and in other countries where religion has a major role in society, is it damaging to democracy at the end of the day? I mean, is it a positive reaction? Is it a positive political move to have different parties that are based on religion? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Other
Thank you, Professor Philip. Thank you, Professor Philip, and thank you, Professor Mustafa, for this interesting lecture to know more about the international experience for democratization. And Professor Philip, you mentioned that the positive neighborhood effect is very important for promoting democracy. And so, can you?
What's the effect of? I'm in trouble hearing you.
I can
you can just repeat what loudly.
I just said that you mentioned that a positive neighborhood effect is very important for promoting democracy. All right, and the Arab League is not interested in promoting democracy in the Middle East. All right, but I think the African Union can play that role. The African Union during the last 2 decades was very interested, was against the military coups, and was promoting democracy through supporting the democratic government. I think the African Union can play that role with Egypt, Tunisia, and of course Libya. Do you think so, or?
All right.
Thank you for the big talk. Actually, you gave me a new vision of my position. So thank you for that. Actually, I have a comment and a question. For the comment, why people mix between prosperity and democracy, and why do they link both of them? I guess because we have this kind of stereotyping that we have the North rich democratic countries, and we have the opposite, the dictator and poor countries like Iran and China and everything. So we are just categorizing the world into two camps, the Western happy camp and the Eastern bad camp. That's why, yeah.
Oh, I see, okay.
So that's why people are mixing between prosperity and democracy the whole time. For the question, I wonder, did the civil society have a significant role? Did the civil society have a significant role in the democratization of other countries that went through this experience decades ago? Thank you.
Other comments?
Let's not take it. Let me.
All right, yeah.
Okay.
You have 3 questions here. One
Three is fine. Yeah.
African Union and neighborhood effect and prosperity and democracy. I need to put this the role of civil society in other countries.
Okay, it cannot be an accident that every time I have spoken to an audience in this country, somebody's asked the same question about religion. Okay, so it seems to be a pretty established question, okay, and somehow it's salient in people's minds. Now, I have to say that, yes, as we started thinking about democratization, there was considerable concern about religion, because the orthodoxy said Catholics were antithetic to democracy. And indeed, if you look at a plot of Catholic countries with a Catholic majority democratized later, or in the case of Spain and Portugal and most Latin American countries didn't democratize. And in many, many cases, the Catholic Church was an active anti-democratic party, so to speak. Now, we were wrong, right? That is to say, it turned out, among other things, that the Catholic religion changed in the course of this, thanks to Vatican II, but also changed in the sense that people's relationship to the Catholic Church became quite different in these 30 or so years. So that the idea that people, because they had a certain religion, could not possibly be, quote, good Democrats or contributors, simply evaporated. Now, when I say that, everybody says, okay, that's Catholics. You know, we're different. The Muslim religion is different. Now, I don't know much about that, you know, just as an outsider, but I wonder if it's that different in the following ways. First is this idea, is it the case that religion in this country or in other Middle Eastern countries is immutable, a constant and not a variable? What we discovered was that religion was a variable, not a constant. It changed, in fact, even in the course of democratization itself. So you could have the Catholic hierarchy, so to speak, opposed to democratization, but in the course of democratization, they learned to live with it, so to speak, and it became even an important component of many of the Christian democratic parties in particular. Right? So is it correct to assume that when you say religion, you mean it's a constant, that it's not itself going to change either through its own internal evolution as a function, for example, of modernization or development, or as a function of its being within an increasingly democratic society and therefore changing, so to speak, many of its aspects due to democratization itself. Okay, so that's the first question. The second is, I keep trying to understand what people mean by religion. So I look at religion and I see at least 3 different things. And I want to know what people mean by it. On the one hand, a religion is a set of distinctive beliefs, practices, beliefs related to each other. Right? And I gather, especially in Islam, there are these famous 5 principles which presumably define a lot of what that is, okay? And presumably, of course, other religions have the same, a different set, a definable set of beliefs. So what makes you religious and what makes religion a political force is the conformity to those key principles, let's say, and that it unifies the practitioners. Secondly, a religion is also an organization. Now this is when we talked about the antithetic nature of Catholicism, what we were talking about was not the content of the Catholic religion as much as the Pope, as the papacy, as the hierarchical structure which had historically been opposed to democracy in Italy and elsewhere in Europe and had this very authoritarian hierarchical structure. And so what counted was not so much what was in the religion as such, but the way in which that was interpreted, practiced, and, so to speak, disciplined, used as a discipline through this organization. So organizational structure is another way of thinking. Finally, there is this idea that religion is simply a form of cultural identity. So you are Catholic. My favorite example of the country I know best, I guess, is Brazil. On paper, Brazil is the most Catholic country in the world. There are more Catholics in Brazil than any other place, right? So they talk about being the biggest Catholic country, blah, blah, blah. In fact, almost no Brazilians go to church, right? More Brazilians practice Protestantism than Catholicism in terms of where they go to church. And what's even more embarrassing is the same Brazilians go both to Protestant and Catholic church, not to mention various African cults, which they also go to. So for them, you know, being a Catholic is part of being Brazilian. You get baptized, and it's just part of, you know, speak Portuguese and you're Catholic, and then a few other things, football and I don't know what else, and that makes you Brazilian. But it's not, shall we say, disciplining you. The organization of the church in Brazil is not impotent, but it's not a very significant political force. And most Brazilians pay no attention whatsoever to what bishops or you know, even their local priests tell them. So it's just, so I ask you, now I'm assuming that when you say religion, you mean the first, which is presumably the most problematic from a democratic point of view, because I also gather that the Muslim Islamic religion is not, you know, I don't know enough about it, but it's certainly not as hierarchical and authoritarian as the Catholic religion. It's much more dispersed in its organizational structure, I think. Right? And then, of course, there's also this business of competing organizational structures, which, you know. So I'm just saying, this is our experience. Religion is important, but it's of relatively minor importance, and it changes in its importance as democratization occurs. That's our experience. But I'm immediately told that you're working with the wrong analogy. Catholic religion is not the same as the Islamic religion, and therefore we are both religions, but they don't have as much in common as I'm assuming or other people.
Yes, but I'm talking about the political parties that depend on religion. Like, for instance, even in West Europe, there are many who are fanatic Catholics or who want the societies to go back to the conservative lives.
Yeah, lots of people. I mean, the most interesting case is Spain, of course. Spain was thought to be, and of course, Catholicism was an official religion and a major component of the previous autocracy. Right? And everybody thought that Spain is one of the most Catholic countries, in fact, more Catholic than Italy, among other things. Right? No, there is no such thing as a Catholic party in Spain. People expected a Christian Democratic Party to emerge in the way it did in Germany and the way it did in Italy. No, there is no Christian Democratic in Portugal. In fact, with the exception of Chile, there's no Christian Democratic Party in any of these countries. So the church found itself, so we say, incapable of converting and dominating and organizing itself as a political